Hello, and welcome to the 35th BFI Flair London LGBTIQ+ Film Festival and this special event in the series, The Makers. I'm delighted we have a very special guest with us. He is an extraordinary individual with a great track record. He's Mr. David France, and he's a really multi-talented personality, and I'm really looking forward to talking to him. He's best known now as a documentary filmmaker, but he's been many different things: a journalist, an activist, and an all-round great human being. You were born in Kalamazoo, according to the internet. Can you tell us what it was like growing up in that area and when you first discovered something of gay life?
Well, I was actually born just outside of New York City, but moved at a young age to the Midwest. So I was raised as a Midwesterner. I have all of the traits that would invest in someone. I grew up in Western Michigan, as you point out, which was a very, very conservative, very religious place. It's the northern wing of the Bible Belt in the US. And it was a place of great hostility to queer people. And as a result, there were no queer people. There was no queer community. There was no queer anything. And in America at that time, there were no figures on the national stage who were identified as queer. So it was possible, and in fact, I think the more likely than not that people like me grew up thinking that they were the only person who felt and thought the way they did, and that I certainly felt that isolation as I was growing up, and I knew that people who people made a sport of hunting for gay people, and harming them, and so it was a dangerous place. It was a place that I felt I needed to get out of as soon as I could, and unfortunately, I was not able to get out until after university. So I left for good when I was 21.
And what was the first exposure? I mean, did you see something on television, or is there a magazine, or just some chat that revealed to you the existence of the gay world?
Well, I actually did. I went to the library and looked it up. And the reference in the card catalog at the time under homosexuality sent me instead to sexuality, deviant. So that was the shelf on which all the books relating to gay people were filed. And there were very few of them. There were mostly medical horror accounts of this problem of perversion. And so, that kind of codified for me this sense that that what I was thinking and feeling was really out of pace. I was able to find occasional sexual encounters as a teenager, mostly with older men, with strangers, and those were something of an outlet, something of a kind of a confirmation that others existed. So I guess it wasn't until I was in high school that I started reading about the formation of the early modern LGBTQ movement, the Gay Liberation Front, for example, Gay Activist Alliance. I knew by high school that I had to get out of the middle of the country in order to survive. And at the time in the States, this sense for me was that if you had that the New York City was a political community and that San Francisco was a cultural community, and that those were your choices. And so I set my aim on New York because I wanted to find the political center and force of the movement. And so I kept trying to get to New York, and it took me a while.
And then you got to New York in 1981, which is a very key moment in all kinds of ways. The gay movement was alive and had been generating the great hedonistic upsurge of Studio 54 and the Baths and the Piers. And you were there right at that key moment. But can you tell us, what was it like for you arriving at that moment?
It was certainly fascinating. I should say that when I was in university, I co-founded the university's first LGBTQ organization. And we were warned by the administration not to meet on campus. We were reviled and exiled. And so it was the beginning, really, of kind of the arrival to the Midwest of the liberation movement. So I was really thrilled to get to New York. I arrived just in time for the Gay Pride Parade of 1981. And that was thrilling. It was so thrilling to see hundreds and hundreds of thousands of people. And then within a couple of weeks, by early July, the New York Times published its first report about the mysterious gay cancer, they called it. So there was already warnings on the horizon that everything was going to change.
And whereabouts did you live in New York?
I moved to the East Village almost right away. The East Village was a place where it was where the kind of the drug trade was rampant. It was commonplace to see people with guns holding up other people on street corners. But you could get an apartment for just over $100. And it was also a very queer neighborhood. So it was where, RuPaul lived in the neighborhood, and it was where the kind of edgy art world was taking hold, and kind of queer culture as alternative culture had its roots. So it was a really exciting place, dangerous and exciting and affordable.
Yeah, I stayed on East 4th and Bowery in '82, I think. So I kind of really know what it was to come down in the morning and see like a clusterfuck of drunks just hanging on to empty bottles. And I was warned by my host always to carry mugger money. He said, always carry at least $10 mugger money so they won't kill you. And it was kind of wild and exciting. And but I'm just interested in what you, because of your subsequent filmmaking career, were you involved politically at that time? I mean, ACT UP wasn't founded until 1987, but there were other things. Gay Men's Health Crisis obviously existed, and there were lots of initiatives around the village. Were you an activist in any sense?
I was. I had two major engagements. One was with the organization that built the march, the Gay Pride March every year. And so I was a member of that committee. And I also worked with an organization called the Lavender Left, which is a kind of a coalition of socialist, leftists, communist, anarchist, feminist, queer organizations and individuals. So
our kind of people.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. So I worked with them and edited the newsletter, and that's when I began doing my journalism, which was in 1982, probably, writing for the queer presses, writing for the Gay Community News, which was a Boston-based news collective, but had national and to some degree international circulation.
Now, we in Britain really looked to things like Gay Community News, The Body Politic, and New York Native, as they seemed like light years ahead of the gay press here in Britain. And I'm completely fascinated by the world of the East Village, because, I mean, you could make a film festival only about the East Village and the queer artists and performers from, I don't know, you mentioned RuPaul, but I mean, just there are dozens of, and Divine was a waitress at Phoebe's just across from where I lived. And And I mean, it really is incredible. And I think that actually you can tell from your films that it's drawn from an insider's perspective, that you really couldn't have done the job you did without having gained a huge amount of life skills. So I'm pleased that you are that authentic person who's lived experience. But it didn't seem like you were preordained to be a filmmaker. Had you ever hankered after being a filmmaker, or was it something else that drew you into filmmaking?
I was interested in the medium, but not in creating it. So I had worked with a number of productions based on my journalism, to take the work that I had done in journalism and help, or at least offer it to people who could bring it to the screen. So we had produced 2 or 3 films, one a series for Showtime, and that was fun for me, at being what they call kind of source material. And but that was really the extent of my interest in working in film. I kind of hit a wall in print in 2008, 2009, when the economy collapsed, and suddenly I had way too much unprogrammed time because all the places I was writing for at the time, and by then I had moved into the kind of the mass media. I was writing for the Newsweek magazine and New York magazine and others. They had all just collapsed in size because the advertising disappeared. They had collapsed in frequency, and there was the news hole, or the feature well, had shrunk so dramatically that I just wasn't getting any work out. And that's when I started playing with the idea that maybe I could piece together a film myself.
And it's one thing to have the idea to piece together a film, and you can have the best research and the best ideas, but it's like mounting a war that you need so many different resources and skills. And we look to the director, but you're really kind of like the mayor of a small village in a way, or the captain of a ship. And so I'm fascinated how someone who's got editorial skills and can write and talk made the leap into creating a feature-length documentary, and not just any old feature-length documentary, because in this job we see a lot of documentaries, and a lot of them are people with bookshelves behind them and a static camera, and you just want to lose the will to live because they're not really about cinema. And often they don't have that much archive in them, that you're just longing for things to be illustrated, but they're just talk. So maybe this is a chance for us to talk about your first feature, How to Survive a Plague. So you had survived a plague, so that was good research, and you had lived among the people there. How close were you to ACT UP on the ground?
I was, I was a journalist. So I was at that point not an activist. I was not a member of ACT UP, but I attended almost all of its meetings. And I did that as a journalist. And I poured through the literature. I listened to all of the reports from committees. I was constantly looking for sources and tips for articles to write about. By that time I had, my journalism career had been taken over by HIV. And I was writing about that as much as I possibly could. So it was part of my beat to go to those meetings. And I think the difference between me and a member was not the number of times that I attended, but that I didn't vote. And that was the measure of membership in the organization. If you attended 2 or more meetings, you could vote. And I just never voted. So But I did write the first feature piece about ACT UP for the Village Voice. And then I continued writing about the organization, always from this kind of remove. ACT UP was interesting in that it had kind of, kind of in-house or captured journalists that, who worked at other places, who were also members of the organization. And I was, I think, seen by the people in ACT UP as being an outsider in that way. Although I was as queer as anybody, and I was there with my lover at the time, who was, obviously sick, and it was clear that we were engaged in the same universe, but in different ways.
And what is extraordinary about the film is the kind of freshness and sense of you're right, pushed right in to the action. It's almost like you're in the French Revolution, that you're part of the discussions, that everything is possible, that people are doing things in a different way. There's an anger and an urgency. How did it happen that ACT UP was so well documented?
It was fascinating. I remembered that there were cameras everywhere as I was thinking about going back to that time. It was the first social justice movement that documented itself in such a thorough manner. They did it by actually having a committee to do it. And that committee was art school graduates, film school graduates, typically people with enough money to buy the equipment, but the equipment was relatively new. There was a revolution in motion pictures with the advent of the camcorder, which was, came to market in 1982, was suddenly rather affordable. And by 1987, it was very affordable to certainly middle-class people. So there was a dozen people at any moment filming those meetings and filming those demonstrations and those subcommittee meetings and even meetings at home and time at home. And there's a lot of self-documentation. So that's what I thought, to go back and see if I could look at enough of that stuff to mostly get a sense of remembering the energy there. And then I thought, could it be possible to tell this story of this period of AIDS activism, 10 years, just by using that footage? Could you follow individuals? Could you tell kind of cinematic stories based on, very old and poorly preserved videotape?
I mean, that's a really key issue. It's one thing to film the stuff, but then 20 years later, where is it? Is it under somebody's bed? Is it archived? Yeah. If it is archived, has it even been catalogued? Are the numbers right? Is it in the right box? Does anyone know it's there? And part of the wonder of the film, I think, is that archival achievement, alongside, of course, I mean, in order to find the things to put in your film, you have to edit. So that means that somebody, and I assume it must have been you along with a lot of other people, had to sit through many hours of very complex and dense footage. I mean, how long did that take?
Absolutely true. And you're right that it was scattered everywhere. And there was an archive of AIDS activism videotape put together at the New York Public Library by the filmmaker Jim Hubbard, who made his own film on using that footage called United in Anger. And so I went to Jim and said, could you help me understand what's going on with that collection? And he knew it intimately and was able to walk me through the parts of it that were cataloged. But a huge portion of it, maybe 40%, wasn't cataloged. And ultimately, we had to talk the New York Public Library into bringing us those boxes, just bringing them back from storage and letting us give an inventory of those boxes to the librarians so that they could, and the archivists, so that they could begin the process of making them available to other people. But they allowed us to move tapes out of there and digitize them. And that was the basis, really, the beginning of the process. And then from there, I guess it was mostly me, went to the friends and individuals of people whose stories I wanted to tell, and asked what they had kept. And then I could see cameras in the old footage by people who hadn't donated to that archive. So I would try to find them, and if I couldn't find them, I would try, or if they had died, which is likely and happened in many instances, I would try to find their estates or their lovers who survived them or their family members, and begin the process that way. And almost, actually, every person who had died, their archives were preserved by somebody who loved them, and they allowed me to preserve, to digitize them so that they wouldn't get further decayed. And then we had, hundreds of hours that we brought in as digitized files to go through. And that's when we started really putting together a crew. And we brought in, I think at one point we had 12 people who were, who were viewing all of the footage and, just trying to find out what was in it. And they were looking, we had a wanted post, a wall that we called the wanted wall. So anybody's face who we wanted to follow, any person we wanted to follow, we had their faces up at different ages. And so we had interns, and they were mostly interns who were just looking for those people, just trying to find them. And that took, what did that take? That took probably a year to do that. And then we brought in an editor. I had reached out to Woody Richman, who had edited a film that I had seen the year before that I just loved. And it was called Trouble the Water, about Hurricane Katrina in New Orleans. And it was, of all the films that came out of New Orleans and that horror that happened there, it was the most emotional and forgiving and human and humane of any of them. And it had difficult characters in it, but you loved them. And I thought, I need somebody who knows how to do this. And I reached out to him again and again and again. He kept not taking my calls. So then he would make appointments and not show up. And then he took a job with somebody else, and that fell apart. So he called me and said, I'm ready to do this. What is it you're working on? So he came to a meeting with me, and I showed him some of the footage. He's younger than me by maybe 15 years. He had lived in New York in that time, or during the time of ACT UP, but he was straight, African-American, and just knew nothing about it. And that was the weird part of this plague, that you could live in New York and not know what was happening because it was so targeted in the communities that it struck. And it just never struck his. And he just was entirely naive, and it just shocked him. And he agreed to come on. And then we brought on another editor, Tyler Walk, because there was just so much to do. And it took the two of them a year working in 2 cutting rooms to cut the film.
What I love about the film is that there are lots of emotional bombs that I find it impossible to watch without crying, which doesn't mean that it's great art. Maybe just I'm very sentimental, but I think that there's something about the construction of the film that you fall in love with all those people, and you feel intensely their hopes and dreams. And I mean, when Peter Staley says, "I will die," you're just willing desperately for him to survive. And actually, when I first saw the film, I wasn't even sure if he was still alive. I immediately Googled him and kind of heaved a huge sigh of relief but obviously many people did not survive. And I think that, I mean, what a lot of people don't really understand is the kind of wound that the gay world suffered. And I don't think that people really still have properly understood how much we lost, that you know, the brightest, the most intelligent, the wittiest, the cleverest, the ones you wanted most to be with, they were just gone.
Mm-hmm.
And when you take that away from a community, it's going to just destabilize it. And I think that you get a real sense towards the end of the film how the losses are kind of stacking up and the drugs aren't there. But then the drugs arrive, and it's not that we found the rainbow, but and the film. So it arrived in the world, and how did it go?
It surprised the hell out of me, really. I mean, I didn't know until that moment how powerful, how culturally powerful a documentary could be. You know, it was like riding a rocket. It was, you know, I knew audiences would like it, or I sensed that they would. But the way it, you know, changed the way people talk about that history. It changed the way it's taught. I mean, it wasn't taught before, and suddenly the film was being taught and is being taught, you know, as history. And you know, it carried the story of our plague to all sorts of people who hadn't seen it before, including, you know, generation after generation of new queers coming up who had no example of kind of gay heroes. I mean, there were no imagery. There was no imagery of kind of, you know, of the heroic work that queers had done in that time or any other time that had really been lifted up and celebrated. And so, yeah, it was a wild ride. And I remember, you know, taking it to Sundance and premiering it there, and the audience went crazy. And I just couldn't talk. You know, I was just, you know, I thought I was going to cry. It was too overwhelming. So then I immediately introduced Peter Staley to the audience, and they leapt to their feet and started reaching for his clothing, really like he was some sort of a, you know, a spiritual leader. And that's when I knew I had created a monster in Peter. And he has since become this incredible figure that, you know, when I found him and when I started talking to all the people who were in the film, who had survived that time from ACT UP, they were really all, you know, scattered and in some state of, you know, post-trauma, I think. And certainly I was, and certainly I hadn't been able to go back and even talk about that time, and privately, much less publicly. And to have it all unleashed there in the front of you know, an audience of 800 or whatever it was super overwhelming.
And you went on to be nominated for the Oscar for Best Documentary. So that must have been a wild conclusion to your filmmaking journey.
It certainly was, yeah.
It is an extraordinary film, and I think it should be shown to all your films. There should be a homosexual university that is every young queer is forced to watch a certain amount of stuff, but that's what we try to do in the festival. But your next film was also set in New York, but a slightly different New York. It was the death and life of Marsha P. Johnson. Can you tell us what drew you to that project and how it came to be?
I had so much fun working with, you know, the dozens of people who helped me make that film, who taught me how to make a film, who taught me how to tell a story visually, that it really ruined me for going back to my investigative journalism. I wanted to collaborate. I wanted to keep doing that sort of work. So I started making lists of stories that might also have not been told, that it might be interesting to go back to. You know, I was remembering that I think I was influenced a great deal by Larry Kramer, who in the 90s, early 2000s, started complaining about the way queer subject matter is taught, the rise of queer theory, and he spoke out against that. He kept saying, "Where's queer history? Like, where is queer history?" And I recognized that it certainly was not in documentary film. So that's why I put Marsha on that list. And I knew Marsha. I had known Marsha and Sylvia Rivera from the time that we overlapped in New York, which is a number of years. And I was at the Village Voice. I was writing for the Village Voice in 1992 when Marsha Johnson died, when her body was fished out of the Hudson River. And my editor called me and said, I want you to investigate this story. It seems that maybe something untoward had happened to her. People were demonstrating around the village for the police to do more in their investigation. And so I began to look at those circumstances. But it was the year that my lover, Doug Gould, got very sick in 1992, and the year that he died. And that took me away from the project. I never finished it. And so I always felt that that was a kind of an unfinished business, this person whom I had known and admired. I can't say we were particularly friends, but we were, we always said hello to each other. She was a fixture, just a daily, constant, day and night fixture on Christopher Street, which was the mountaintop of gay life in the US at the time. And no one had gone back to tell her story. So that's what I set as the next goal. And I knew it was going to be harder because she didn't overlap with the camcorder universe much of her life.
But still, you do have an incredible range of footage. I'd actually forgotten until I came back to the film that Marsha was part of the Hot Peaches troupe, who did come to London at one time.
She came to London. She traveled.
Yes. Yeah. Interesting, the title is The Death and Life of Marsha P. Johnson, because it's almost as much a portrait of Sylvia Rivera, that they're kind of twin souls who found each other and extraordinarily were both at Stonewall and kind of carried on fighting in a way that feels strangely modern in its kind of notion of intersectionality. That many of the things that the rowdy queers at the Gay Pride Day in Washington Square were screaming for Sylvia to get off the stage now seem like almost normal. That, who doesn't want good housing and trans rights? And it's very interesting how the discourse has changed from the early 70s to now. Could you talk us through how you found Victoria Cruz, who is your kind of Miss Marple, the detective in Search?
Yes, absolutely. I actually began working with a different subject, a different person, a different woman who would be the person to do this investigation. And that didn't work out. And we discovered that this was a subject that Victoria Cruz was returning to on her own as she was ending her career and going into retirement from the Anti-Violence Project, which was the organization that had led the community's efforts in trying to determine what happened to Marsha. So I reached out to Victoria and said, would you be interested in doing this with me and letting me film this? And she hesitated. And then she decided she needed to meet me and everybody I was working with first. And at that meeting, she felt that we had the same aims and the same goals in trying to understand what happened to Marsha and trying to look at that as being an emblem of the crimes that are currently happening against the trans community, especially trans women of color like Marsha. And so that began our kind of year-long collaboration.
It's
And I
very
also fell in
chilling.
love with her. She was just an amazing person. I'm still totally in love with Victoria and everything that about her, her kind of her mysterious kind of native feeling that she gives in this, you know, how she feels things. She just feels things. We went with her, for example, to the river, the first time we went to the river, and she felt the spot where Marsha probably had lost her life. And just to be that in touch as she was with her emotions and her connection to this story, to this history, was amazing.
And the moment where she talks about the badge that fell off Sylvia's jacket or whatever she was wearing, I found very spooky as well, but also very chilling, the portrait of the police force at the time, that the Sixth Precinct, that we always think that New York is the Emerald City over the rainbow. It's gay life is wonderful there, but actually you show very clearly that maybe the police weren't quite on the same page at all.
That was the precinct that raided the Stonewall in 1969. That was the precinct that harassed queers and exposed them to media ridicule, which would cost them their jobs and lead often to suicide. And some of the same people were still there in 1992 when Marsha went missing. So that it still had the DNA of that, of the pre-Stonewall police force. And that, I think, was very clear to the people who were protesting in front of the Sixth Precinct around Marsha's death. And you know, kind of a fascinating part of that story, as we found in the archive, was that they were probably still as kind of mob connected as they were in 1969. You know, in 1969, it was a hand in glove relationship that the police had. They would allow the mafia to operate these illegal clubs because it was illegal to serve a cocktail to an apparent homosexual, or whatever the law said at the time. And they would take payoffs for it. So there was still that relationship.
And given you the appetite to carry on making another film, which is your most recent film, Welcome to Chechnya, which in a strange way is a kind of amalgam of some of the themes. I mean, it's a shocking film, extremely shocking. Can you tell us how it came to be and your discovery of the story of what was happening?
Absolutely. It was, in a way, it's my return to journalism and my roots. It's, you know, a story that's happening today, not a piece of history. It's not archival driven at all. And in fact, I had been following the story of what was going on in Chechnya through the pages of the newspapers. And it was from an article in the New Yorker that I learned about what activists were doing, and the length to which activism was going in Russia to try and counter this. And the fact that governments around the world were for some reason mute in the face of this ongoing genocide. So I called up the journalist from the New Yorker, Masha Gessen, a well-known Russian dissident, a queer journalist living in New York, someone I had known for decades, and said, should I do this? Can I do this? And would you join me to do this? And they said yes. So that's what started the process. And Masha reached out to the people that they had visited for their reporting in Moscow, the Olga Baranova, who runs the shelter system there still, and made an introduction. And I was there within the week beginning my filming.
So technology has been an important part of your filmmaking before, but in the 21st century, technology is a double-edged sword, is that everyone has a camera, but surveillance is all the more easy, and things like Grindr or whatever the online sexual platforms are, means that there's a great vulnerability to queers who are under attack. But it's also a great research tool that, I mean, the film has got some of the most horrific of violence against queer people that your editors found on the internet that are truly chilling. But sometimes in the queer world, we feel we had Stonewall, we've had gay marriage, everything is happy. We just need to kind of decide what to have for dinner and where we go on holiday. But in this story, it's as if queers are thrust back beyond Kalamazoo into like an almost medieval kind of hunting of queers. And it's very frightening. And when I was watching the film, I was thinking a lot of the time, who is holding the camera? Because we are so intimately in this gay railroad, underground resistance to get people out of Chechnya whose lives are so literally in danger. So who was holding the camera?
Well, it was a combination. It was principally Oskar Kurov, who was a Russian documentary filmmaker, a dissident filmmaker, queer himself. He had made a seminal film about the so-called anti-gay propaganda law in Russia, and that was another introduction of Masha Gessen's, and he agreed to be my producer on the ground in Moscow, in Russia, and also to be the principal cinematographer, but we couldn't use kind of standard equipment, documentarian tools. Like we couldn't be seen carrying, lighting stands, et cetera, in and out of these places. So we just bought a camera. He that picked it out as a consumer camera and snuck it into the safe house and left it there. And that way there would be no evidence of us like moving, footage back and forth. And then I was the, second camera. And I was shooting on my iPhone, and we combined the two. And there were some scenes that he couldn't shoot for one reason or another, mostly because we felt it was important to have a woman shooting instead of a man, in which case we brought in, there were two other cinematographers who came in to help.
Security must have been on your mind a lot of the time, because you just feel the risk, and it's very clear that these people are at risk, and you must have been at risk there. What was your security like? You can't have gone around with big burly guards?
No, not at all. We would rehearse each one of our scenes that we were going to shoot. We would examine what the risks would be. We would try to think everything through, including what to do in case we got caught, or in any circumstance that might be a threat to us. And one of the things that we did for each time we shot outside of the safe house system was to hire a criminal defense attorney in every city that we were traveling through, so that we would have somebody right there we could call, who could come and represent us in some way, and also we were GPS tracked by my producer back in New York, who knew the route that we were traveling, and if we deviated from the route, she would trigger this kind of international kind of cascade of phone calls and texts that would produce the local lawyer that we were looking for, et cetera.
So you were in Moscow. Did you go to Chechnya at all yourself?
Yeah,
You did.
yeah. So that for example, that scene, that rescuing of Anya scene, that was a case where we needed they needed two women to go with the girl to take, and they were going to be older family friends, to go with the girl to shop for a dress outside of the Chechnya. So that's an instance where we brought in a different cinematographer, and she was working with a hidden camera. And I was sitting across the restaurant with two other people. I was posing as a tourist and taking a lot of selfies, and at the same time shooting with my cell phone, what those scenes were. And so we traveled in separate cars. Nobody knew that we were together as a unit or working on anything at all. Although we were the second car, so we kept an eye on them as they were going. And again, New York had GPS in both cars.
So shooting under these very difficult circumstances, there's obviously a risk to people who might be seen. So you took the very technologically advanced decision to digitally modify the faces of the people. And for anyone who hasn't seen the film, it's a real moment of literal revelation when you see the real face of one of the key protagonists in the film, Maxim Lupanov. How did that come into being? Did you know you were going to do that all the way along?
No, and this is the thing about being a kind of a new filmmaker. I just didn't know what couldn't be done. And when I entered the shelter system, I promised the people who had survived this horror that I would disguise them. And I really didn't know how I was going to do it, but I wanted to film their faces, and I wanted to experience their journey through their faces, and which is something that no one else had done. There had been a news crew had been in there and interviewed people in shadow, in silhouette, behind doors, for example. And so it was a lot to ask, and it was a lot for them to agree to. And so I did film their faces, and that meant I had to be very protective of the footage as I moved it out of the safe house, and we would transfer it immediately to encrypted drives, and then leave behind the cards, which we would overwrite in case those got into somebody else's hands, not just enough to delete the footage, but we wrote meaningless data over the top on those cards so that they would not be retrievable. And then it was, a period of many months of research and development to find what the approaches were. And I didn't want to use anything that would subtract from the humanity of the individuals. And everything we tried seemed to do that. And then we discovered that there's, this kind of new thinking in the VFX world based on some successes, right? So The Irishman, for example, was a film where the face of a younger actor was put on an older body. I, Tanya, we had seen how they were able to put Margot Robbie's face on the double who was doing the ice skating. And so we thought, well, what about that? And we were told that was impossible, it was too expensive. And then we found somebody who was willing to give it a try. He had this theory that he could automate it by building this kind of algorithmic approach that would allow us to put somebody else's brand new face over the top. And he ran a couple of experiments in it. The first time we looked at it, we thought, this is remarkable. Like, those people really are disguised to the level that we had promised, which was that even their own families wouldn't recognize them. And so then we said, all right, let's do it for the whole film. There were 23 people in the film whose faces needed disguising. And in 40 clips in the film, 400 clips in the film. So it was a huge undertaking. It took us almost a year just to do that.
Well, it's a towering achievement of a film, incredibly emotional, and really, really worth seeing. Can you tell us, it was 2017, 2018 that the initial purges happened. Can you tell us what kind of effect the film had on that political situation, and what's happening now in Chechnya?
The news did break in early 2017 in April, and then it seemed to go quiet. But that doesn't mean that the campaign stopped. It's just that they ran out of leads, and several times since then they've gotten new leads and have gone and rounded up dozens, scores, maybe more. So this is an ongoing problem. It's never been, it's a campaign that was pronounced by the president of Chechnya, and he's never reversed that campaign. So the important part for me in bringing this film forward was to let the world know that this is happening, and that and to bring forward the voices of the people to whom it was happening. That was the thing about replacing faces and voices, was that it really gave them back a face and a voice to be able to narrate their own stories. And we hope that it would have a political impact, and it certainly has. It's been used to find finally some agreement in the State Department to bring sanctions against Ramzan Kadyrov in Chechnya, sanctions from the UK, sanctions from the EU, and all of that since the film screened. And that's the testament to the work of the activists who are taking the film with them to screenings with lawmakers, saying, this is what we're up against, this is what we're doing, this is what we need help with. It's still going on, unfortunately, so that we still need this kind of political pressure to continue. The government of Chechnya sponsored on their state-controlled television station, Grozny TV, a 15-minute denunciation of the film, which was pretty fantastic. And then with BBC News Russia, we found a partner to actually bring the film out with us in Russia. And that has caused quite a stir and consternation in the Kremlin. The Kremlin has denied over and over when reporters ask, because they have now, whether they've seen the film, whether or not they have positions on any of this, and they just deny comment over and over. So it still needs the kind of the political heft of diplomacy behind it. But I think that it has brought the conversation to a new place and empowered the activists who needed power to continue their work.
Well, we're going to have to end it there, but thank you very much, David, for telling us about your story from the streets of Greenwich Village to the world stage with Welcome to Chechnya. And you have a new project. Are you able to say anything about it just very quickly? Because I know you have to get away.
Yes, this is a first project that is not necessarily queer. It's the documentation behind the scenes of the scientific work that has been going on to bring the vaccines out to market for COVID. And I'm working on it with HBO.
Well, we look forward to it and everything else you do. You can catch David Francis films on many platforms internationally, BBC, Netflix, and Prime Video. Thank you very much, David.
Thank you, Brian.
We hope to see you again in real life somewhere.
Wonderful conversation. Thank you. Be safe.
Thank you.